Mobsters, Beauty Queens, and Fast Times on the Arctic Circle by David Magee. I double-clicked the mugshot of an aging man with cold black eyes. James Whitey Bulger, the notorious Boston mobster who had eluded capture for 17 years, had finally been convicted. The story was riveting. But it was the woman cited halfway through the piece as having played a pivotal role in bringing Bulger to justice that brought me to the edge of my seat. I knew her. We had met in a chance encounter some 30 years earlier. Some chance encounters touch people only lightly, wrote psychologist Albert Bandura, who studied the phenomena. Others leave more lasting effects. Our encounter in June 1982 was of the latter variety, at least from my perspective. Ronald Reagan was in the White House, Ebony and Ivory was the #1 single, and I had just finished my senior year of college. But still a 3-hour language course shy of a degree, I was en route to summer school in Europe where I hoped to bang out the incomplete credits and call myself a graduate. She, the woman in the article, was among the last aboard the DC-8 that was fully loaded and ready to push back from the Icelandair gate. From my aisle seat I noticed her the moment she stepped through the hatch. Tall and slender with blonde shoulder-length hair and high Nordic cheekbones, she was hard to miss. Wearing jeans and a T-shirt with a bag slung casually over one shoulder, she breezed down the aisle like a runway model. As she approached, I stole a final glance, then turned back to my paperback before she passed. Only she didn't pass. Stopping at my row, she tossed her bag into the overhead and dropped into the empty seat just across the narrow aisle. I froze. Should I acknowledge her? Should I say something? Maybe a simple smile? I stared blankly ahead as my insecurities duked it out. Of course not. She's way out of your league. You're a kid relative to her. In the end, I would play it safe and keep to myself. But that would change. 30,000 feet over Newfoundland, I flagged down a stewardess, as they were then called, and asked for an aspirin. As the attendant disappeared toward the galley, the woman across the aisle did the unexpected. She reached into my self-imposed isolation and touched me on the arm. "Do you have a headache?" she asked. I turned to face her and was momentarily mesmerized. Only a cyborg could have eyes so blue. "Your head," she smiled and tapped her temple. "Oh, yes," I replied, then followed with a sad face and a nod. "Give me your hand." Before I could process the request, my left hand was already on its way up, over and into her waiting palm. Had she told me to stick it in a sausage grinder, I'd have no doubt complied. Cradling my wrist in one hand, she squeezed the meaty space between my thumb and forefinger with her other. "My name is Anna, by the way." As she applied pressure, Anna explained how stimulating this particular cluster of nerve endings would relax my muscles, increase my blood flow, and presumably alleviate my headache. If nothing else, she had certainly managed to increase my blood flow. "Tell me when it starts to feel better," she said. "Not on your life." Our cross-aisle exchange had caught the attention of passengers behind us. Glancing back, a dozen gape-mouthed men crooked their necks and jockeyed for a view of the action. "So, will this be your first visit to Iceland?" Anna's accent was more pronounced now. "Iceland?" I cocked my head to one side. "I'm going to Luxembourg." "Well, you're stopping in Reykjavik first." It hadn't occurred to me that Icelandair flights crossing the Atlantic stopped over in Iceland. "It's a wonderful place. You should get off and stay a day or two, and then go on to Luxembourg." I felt a nudge from the passenger seated next to me, a Swedish man in his mid-30s who had eavesdropped on our conversation. "Now how's the head?" she eventually added. "It stopped hurting a while back," I replied. "Shame on you." She released my hand, but the conversation continued for the next 4 hours. Anna was knowledgeable, intelligent, and well-read. In short, she was an engaging conversationalist. Through bits and pieces, I picked up that she was born and raised in Iceland. After school, she worked a while in London, then moved to Los Angeles. I also learned that she was en route to Iceland to promote one film and appear in another. Though I'd heard of the movie she was promoting, The Sword and the Sorcerer, I hadn't seen it. As for the one she was shooting, Anna described it as an Icelandic rock musical, before adding, almost parenthetically, that her husband was the producer and that she'd be meeting him on the set in Iceland. Husband? I was actually relieved. "You know, you should really stay for a while in Iceland," she said as we began our descent toward Keflavik. This time her voice was more emphatic. "How many chances like this do you get?" My wheels were turning. "Tell you what," she added after a long pause, "I'll put you up and show you around, and you can buy yourself a sweater with what it would cost for a hotel." Before I could reply, the Swede next to me interjected and answered on my behalf. He says yes. So at Keflavik International, I jumped ship and trekked off into an unknown land with a strange and beautiful woman. Once inside the terminal, Anna was besieged by fellow Icelanders. From cabbies to counterclerks, everyone knew her. More impressive, Anna gave each the sense that she knew them as well. We worked our way outside where her grandparents waited curbside. They were a handsome couple, both lean with the same high cheekbones and fair hair as Anna. Neither spoke English, however, so I sat quietly and allowed them to catch up during the half-hour ride into Reykjavik. At her grandparents' apartment, we sat at the kitchen table and shared a pot of Icelandic coffee, cloth-filtered and with plenty of chicory. Afterwards, and to my surprise, Anna announced that she'd be leaving me in her grandparents' custody while she tended some business. "You'll have fun," she said with a twinkle in her cyborg eyes. "I promise." "I'm good," I replied. What else could I say? I was driftwood on an open river. I could only go with the flow. During my first hour in Iceland, I picked up a single word, takk. It meant thank you, and I wore it out. I thanked them for everything. But for my one-word vocabulary and a few universal gestures and facial expressions, I had no means of communicating with my consigned hosts. Consequently, I had no forewarning what lay in store when, later, we pulled into the parking lot of their local spa. The spa was an open-air cluster of geothermally heated swimming pools, some hot, some cold, and some boiling cauldrons. Boys and girls, men and women, old and young, everyone mixed and mingled. It was the Icelandic equivalent of a village square. That is, except for one minor difference. Everyone was naked, as in butt naked. Like any good Southern boy, I had skinny dipped a time or two, but this was a different kettle of fish. I was stone sober. It was broad daylight, and for some inexplicable reason, I was a genuine curiosity. Bathers lined up by the dozens to check me out. The cold pools might as well have been vats of mercury. I avoided them completely. I stuck to the hot, bubbly waters until I was ready to pass out. Then I'd sprint like a one-armed track star to the next pool. When I arrived, I was a curiosity. By the time I parted, I was a full-blown spectacle. While I entertained bathers at the spa, Anna was busy promoting the European release of The Sword and the Sorcerer with the local press. Afterwards, she fetched me in time to catch the premiere at a downtown cinema. The movie was a fantasy adventure along the lines of Conan the Barbarian, Arnold Schwarzenegger's breakout film. Anna's character was killed off in the second act after the sorcerer's henchman sliced off her tongue. It was a beautiful death, I told her, and that parting gurgle was a nice touch. She agreed. Later, with the movie behind us, we drove east from Reykjavik across a surreal moonscape shrouded in fog and punctuated with outcroppings of black volcanic rock. After an hour, we crossed the Ölfusa River and entered the village of Selfoss. Here, Anna's husband and others were setting up in a high school gymnasium for the final night of shooting on their rock musical. Though my relationship with Anna had been perfectly innocent in body and spirit, the mine, I confess, took a few liberties, I was curious, even anxious, to see how her husband would react when his wife appeared with me in tow. My pulse quickened as we pulled to a stop. Her husband greeted us at the door. If Jakob had any concerns as to who I was or how I came to accompany his wife, he never showed it. No awkward silence, no sideways stare, not even a raised eyebrow. Nothing. Had she introduced me as a eunuch? Inside the gym, the set was ready to go, but for the 100 or so extras scheduled to arrive later. A stage at one end was loaded with amps, microphones, drums, guitars, and all the other accoutrements of an 80s rock band. An area to one side had been roped off for cast, crew, close friends, and eunuchs. Not long after our arrival, the extras, teenagers recruited with free food and beer, began drifting in. Soon the gym floor was packed. "We have 4 hours to shoot," the director explained to the cast and crew. "After that, they'll be drunk and ready to fight." They wasted no time getting to work. I watched in amazement without understanding a word said or sung. 3 hours into the shoot, the director, August, approached me with a request. "Would you be interested in being in the movie?" he asked. "I could use you in the next scene." As he explained it, it was a 2-camera close-up. His leading lady, Raga, was to make her love interest jealous by dancing seductively with another man. I was the lucky man, the dancing seductee, if you will. On the heels of my spa experience, exposing my dancing deficiencies was a trifling request. I agreed and landed my first, and only to date, movie role. True to their Viking heritage, and just as predicted, the first fight broke out shortly after 2 a.m. As the dance floor deteriorated into a drunken brawl, the director called it a night, and we retreated to our secure area to drink, eat, and observe the melee. As I chatted with the cinematographer, an Englishman, he nodded toward Anna, who was just beyond earshot. "You know who she is, don't you?" "I only know what she's told me," I replied. My duty-free Scotch was kicking in. "I know I've seen her somewhere." "Well, for starters, she was Miss Iceland in the Miss Universe contest," he began, "but you probably know her as the Noxzema girl." Noxzema was the Gillette of the 70s and 80s, and their commercials were unforgettable. As the Noxzema girl, she had delivered one of the most memorable commercial lines of the era, "Take it off, take it all off." She had inherited the coveted role from Gunilla Knutson and Farrah Fawcett. I took a sip of scotch and hummed the jingle. "Let Noxzema clean your face, so the razor won't." We left Selfos just as the Arctic sun was peeking over the horizon. The shadows were long, the air was cool, and the cloudless sky was 1,000 shades of blue. It was a quiet ride to the airport. Once there, I thanked Anna for the experience and never saw her again. But the impact of the encounter has lasted a lifetime. It changed, or at least solidified, the way I travel. Though I no longer gallivant with strange, beautiful women, I do travel with the hope, if not expectation, that those I encounter have something fascinating to share. Long after Anna Bjorn dropped me at the airport in Keflavik, she would have another chance encounter, this time with a woman named Catherine Gregg. Both loved animals, and both had taken an interest in feeding the same stray cat that roamed their quiet Santa Monica neighborhood. Unbeknownst to Anna, however, Catherine Gregg was a fugitive, and the FBI was hell-bent on finding her. The FBI figured if they could find Gregg, they would have a good chance of finding her boyfriend as well. While visiting Reykjavik, of all places, Anna happened to see a public service ad on CNN. The ad featured photos of a woman resembling Catherine Gregg and urged viewers to notify authorities with any leads. Anna obliged. Within hours, Catherine Gregg was in custody, and so was her boyfriend, James Whitey Bulger, Jr. As for the Icelandic rock musical, Mio Alt Reynu, for what it's worth, it was among the most successful films in the history of Icelandic cinema.